Have you noticed that the most conscious people are disappearing? It's not a fad nor an escape. It's the survival of the soul. Carl Jung foresaw this, the day when the self would become incompatible with the theater of the persona. The awakened are disappearing because the world has become too toxic for those who truly feel. They can no longer stand the noise, the false, the banal. They are retreating silently, like invisible monks in a digital desert. And the most ironic thing, they're not leaving out of weakness. They're leaving because they've figured it all out. Because when you awaken, participating in the collective unconsciousness becomes spiritual betrayal. You feel it, don't you? The exhaustion, the nausea, the desire to disappear. That's right. You're not breaking, you're evolving. And if this hurts you, if the world already seems too small for your soul, sign up now. Because here, no one will teach you how to belong. Here, I will teach you how to disappear without getting lost. There comes a moment when something inside you breaks, a barely audible snap, but one that changes everything. It's the instant the world's mask begins to crack, and you realize that almost everything around you is an act. Carl Jung would call this a clash between self and persona. The soul screaming for authenticity, while the social figure tries to maintain the theater. It's when you realize that most people don't live, they just act. Work, dating, political opinions, everything revolves around a script no one remembers writing. And you, for some reason, begin to see the flaws. You see the shadow behind the smiles, the emptiness behind the ambition, the mechanicalness in the gestures. It's like waking up in the middle of a collective dream and realizing everyone is still asleep. This awakening isn't glamorous, it's uncomfortable, almost unbearable. Suddenly, what once seemed normal begins to hurt your senses. The noise of superficial conversations, the desperation for acceptance, the cult of appearance, it all sounds false, artificial, dead. Real spirituality, the one Carl Jung described, isn't a rosy light. It's silent destruction. It's when the unconscious begins to spit out truths you've tried to hide from yourself for your entire life. It's as if the shadow decides to present itself, not as a villain, but as a messenger. It shows you that the world outside is merely a reflection of everything you haven't yet wanted to see inside. And that hurts, because awakening doesn't make you special, it makes you responsible. And it is in this responsibility that the abyss lies. Because now you understand the price of individuation, living awake in a sleeping world. You begin to see the games, the subtle manipulations, the masks smiling as they bleed. You try to warn, try to share what you see, but realize that no one wants to wake up. It would be easier to go back to sleep, but something inside you no longer allows it. The self has awakened, and the price of this is no longer fitting into the illusions of before. You feel the rupture between what you are and what you pretend to be, and your body begins to reject any pretense. It's the glitch in the matrix, the flaw that reveals the real. And when the real appears, the spell is broken. But what comes next is even more devastating. Seeing is a punishment. No one tells you this when you begin your spiritual search, when you delve into Carl Jung and learn to name what was once just a diffuse discomfort. But seeing is painful, because you can no longer hide behind ignorance. When the unconscious opens, the world reveals its reverse, a theater of masks, egos, and shadows dancing on the same stage. You see the wounds behind the smiles, the need disguised as kindness, the fear disguised as love, and worst of all, you see yourself there too. There is no longer them. There are only reflections. Awakening cuts deep because it reveals that the collective unconsciousness you thought was out there also lives within you. It's a kind of psychic crucifixion. You find yourself hanging between what you were and what you are becoming, bleeding lucidity. The pain of seeing is physical. The body feels it, the stomach heaves, the heart slows. Talking to people still trapped in their persona is like trying to breathe underwater. You feel the density of unconsciousness vibrating in the air, and every empty word seems to drain your energy. Jung said that the awakening of consciousness is an act against collective nature, and he was right. Human instinct seeks belonging, but the soul seeks truth. And when these two desires conflict, something inside you breaks. This is why many retreat, returning to the comfort of spiritual blindness, trying to numb their gaze with distractions, work, religion, or pleasure. But what has been seen cannot be unseen. Consciousness once ignited cannot be extinguished. That's where the real suffering begins, the lucidity of no return. You walk down the street and see the projections clashing, people warring with their own shadows, believing they're fighting each other. You see couples destroying each other not for lack of love, but for fear of intimacy. You see leaders preaching morality while negotiating with their own darkness. It's a psychological zoo, and you're consciously inside it. This vision doesn't elevate you, it isolates you. Because the more you see, the less you can participate. It's the pain of realizing that all of humanity is staging a play called normal life, and the ticket is unconsciousness itself. And when this becomes unbearable, the inevitable impulse arises, the desire to disappear for a while. But this disappearance isn't yet an escape. It's the prelude to something deeper. The darkest part of humanity isn't in wars, it's in justifications. Carl Jung said that the shadow isn't evil itself, but the refusal to acknowledge it within us. That's why the world is constantly at war, not between countries, but between projections. The other becomes the mirror into which we pour everything we deny ourselves. Society constantly hunts monsters to avoid recognizing its own reflection. The corrupt, the liar, the manipulator. All are archetypes we carry silently while pointing fingers. It's easier to hate than to look. It's more comfortable to attack than to admit. Invisible evil isn't in the crimes we see, but in the thoughts we deny. It resides in indifference, in irony, in the spiritual superiority that believes it has overcome the shadow, but which deep down has only repressed it. This dynamic is the invisible engine of collective chaos. The individual unaware of their own shadow becomes a mass, and the unaware mass becomes destructive. Spirituality without self-knowledge becomes a religion of ego, and the ego disguised as light is the worst kind of darkness. Just look at social media, people competing for virtue, waging moral crusades, condemning the wrong, all while fueling the very hatred they pretend to combat. The collective unconscious is a storm of projected shadows. Jung called this mass psychosis. And the irony, it always stems from fear. Fear of admitting one's own desire, one's own jealousy, one's own greed. Fear of looking into the abyss and seeing that the devil dwells not outside, but within. Those who awaken and begin to see this feel moral nausea. It's like watching a play where everyone screams for justice, holding daggers. You see both sides of the board and realize they're both made of the same psychic matter. It's the same shadow dressed in different causes. And when you try to take a stand, everything seems false, because whichever side you choose is still shadow trying to appear light. The self, when awakened, realizes there is no victory in unconsciousness. The only way out is integration, and integration requires silence. That's why the conscious withdraw, not because they've given up on the world, but because they've already understood that shouting doesn't cure the deaf. They begin to withdraw from the noisy battles, preparing themselves for something the noise prevents, the encounter with the naked truth. There comes a point when the mask begins to suffocate. The persona, that social facade Carl Jung described as necessary for living in society, becomes a prison when the self awakens. You try to continue playing the character the world knows, but something inside you refuses to cooperate. Your body feels, your voice trembles, your soul screams. Pretending becomes impossible. And it's not for lack of will, it's because there's an inner truth demanding space. Real spirituality doesn't make you calmer. It makes you incapable of lying to yourself. It's as if the entire universe conspired to unmask you, tearing away, one by one, the skins you've worn to be accepted. The death of the persona is the collapse of performance. And with it, the illusion of belonging also dies. In this process, everything that was safe begins to crumble. The job that once made sense now makes you nauseous. Conversations feel like rehashed scripts. Even the relationships that once sustained you seem fueled by characters, not people. You begin to realize that much of your life has been built on other people's expectations. What to be, how to act, what to post, what to feel. When the self manifests itself, it doesn't ask for permission. It destroys whatever it needs to be born. And this destruction hurts. It hurts to lose the version of you the world applauded. It hurts to realize that to be whole, you will have to disappoint many. It's at this point that spiritual awakening stops being pretty and becomes real. But something extraordinary happens in the midst of this mourning. A silent relief, the lightness of no longer needing to perform. It's a different kind of emptiness, not that of lack, but of truth. You begin to act with a sincerity that disturbs. You speak what you feel, choose what nourishes you, and distance yourself from what doesn't resonate. This frightens those who still live by their persona because their authenticity is a brutal mirror. And many would rather break the mirror than face their reflection. This is where the process of individuation collapses with the collective, because the authentic no longer fits into the theater. The death of the persona is the birth of the free soul. But freedom has a price, solitude, and it is in this solitude that the call begins to whisper. There comes a time when awakening becomes tiring, not of living but of sustaining lucidity amidst the noise. Carl Jung said that maintaining awareness in unconscious environments consumes vital energy. And he was right. It's like holding a lit candle amid a storm of voices, opinions, and masks. Every conversation requires a filter. Every environment requires vigilance. Every glance demands discernment. The body begins to take its toll. The mind demands silence. The heart demands distance. You realize that the world wasn't made for the conscious. It was made for the adapted. And the more awake you become, the more you feel the weight of collective density. It's the kind of fatigue that can't be cured by sleep because it's not physical. It's the fatigue of the soul that has seen too much. You begin to understand why Jung retreated to Bollingen, his lakeside tower. It wasn't isolation, it was psychic survival. There's a point where spirituality isn't about learning, but about preserving what's been learned. Every social interaction becomes a test of integrity. You realize how starved people are for energy, how conversations revolve around proving themselves, not finding themselves. It's the exhaustion of being the only lucid voice in an environment that prefers the comfort of illusion. And then, slowly, exhaustion turns into choice. The choice to withdraw, not to escape, but to protect itself. It's the soul withdrawing before being drained to death. This exhaustion has subtle symptoms: light sleep, unfounded sadness, a desire to disappear. You feel like every word you utter is draining you of energy. The light of the self begins to flicker, not from weakness, but from overload. Jung called this invisible psychological work, the constant effort to avoid losing oneself in the collective unconscious. And this is where many mistake fatigue for weakness. But true awakening isn't enthusiasm, it's silent resistance. It's carrying a flame in a world of whirlwinds. When you understand this, you begin to hear an ancient call, an inner voice that says, "Come out, withdraw, preserve yourself." And this call, which many interpret as giving up, is actually the beginning of a new stage. the stage of the hermit. There comes a moment when silence ceases to be a choice and becomes destiny. The self, after struggling against the pressures of the persona and the voices of the shadow, begins to demand retreat. Carl Jung called this the necessary retreat, the moment when the soul, saturated with the collective unconscious, decides to hide to avoid becoming ill. It's not escape, it's preservation. It's like a warrior who, after years of battle, realizes that the fight is now internal. Real spirituality isn't made of stages, but of caves. The hermit is the one who retreats to avoid corruption. He understands that to continue participating in a dormant society would be to betray his own awakening. So he disappears, not as one fleeing, but as one returning home. The retreat is brutal because it deactivates everything that sustained you. Without external voices, you're forced to listen to your own. And at first it sounds strange. You feel withdrawal from noise, approval, distraction. It's as if your entire body is addicted to social dopamine, but over time, silence begins to heal. It reorganizes what the noise distorted. You realize how much you lived on autopilot and how much your shadow fed on the little lies you called routine. The hermit is born when human beings understand that solitude is not punishment. It is a laboratory. It is there that the self begins to manifest itself clearly, without interference, without an audience. But this path is not romantic. Silence is a mirror, and a mirror reveals everything. The hermit must look at every fragment of himself that the world has helped him hide. He must face his fear, his ego, his desire to be remembered. Society will call this isolation, failure, escape. But the unconscious knows it is initiation. It is in exile that the spirit reconnects with the source. Jung experienced this in Bollingen. Jesus lived in the desert, Buddha under the tree. Every awakened soul repeats the same archetype. The hermit retreats not out of weakness, but because he has understood something the world has not yet understood. To hear the divine, one must distance oneself from human noise. And in this separation, silence begins to become alchemy. In silence, something begins to melt. The layers of the persona, rigid, polished, social, begin to slowly dissolve until only what is raw, real, and non-negotiable remains. Carl Jung said that true transformation happens when the ego surrenders to the process of individuation, and silence is the crucible where this alchemy occurs. Far from the collective noise, the soul returns to hearing its own frequency. It is in this space of stillness that the shadow begins to approach, not as an enemy, but as a forgotten part, asking for reconciliation. Silence becomes the invisible fire that fuses light and dark, the holy and the profane, the human and the divine. And it is in this inner heat that the self begins to reorganize itself, like gold being purified from the impurities of the ego. But silence is not kind. It strips away your disguises. It makes you realize how many voices in your mind aren't yours. Those of family, religion, fear, desire. True silence is a battlefield, and the enemy is inner noise. At first, it's torture. You try to meditate, and your mind screams. You try to relax, and your body rebels. Modern humans are addicted to stimulation, and being at peace with one's own emptiness seems impossible. But it's in this discomfort that the miracle begins, the rediscovery of one's own center, when silence ceases to be the absence of sound and becomes the presence of the soul, when solitude transforms into sacred territory, when spirituality ceases to be theory and becomes breathing. And then something changes. Your breathing slows, your gaze deepens. Presence begins to heal everything the noise had broken. You realize that silence is not empty, it is a source. It is in silence that the shadow integrates, that the self blossoms, that consciousness expands. You stop reacting and begin to observe. You stop seeking answers and begin to listen. And when you finally understand that silence is not isolation but communion, a new energy is born, that of return. Because the hermit, now transformed, begins to feel that his exile is not the end of the journey, but the prelude to return. He carries within him something the world has forgotten, and the world, even asleep, will begin to call him back. The return is never triumphant. It is silent, almost invisible. After the hermit traverses the subterranean depths of his own soul, something within him changes density. His gaze becomes slower, his words heavier, his presence more rare. Carl Jung said that those who descend into the unconscious and return changed, as if they had seen something that cannot be explained. The individual who has experienced the symbolic death of the persona does not return to the same world. They return to a stage that now seems small, noisy, childish. True spirituality has made him too mature to fit into his old clothes. He no longer seeks an audience or approval. His return is discreet because he understands. Wisdom is not announced, it radiates. Those who knew him before no longer recognize him. There's something about him that disturbs, even in silence. It's the energy of someone who no longer has anything to prove. The light of the self is now constant, and contact with it alters everything around him. He becomes a kind of mirror, and mirrors are dangerous for the asleep. His mere presence awakens discomfort in those who still live in the persona, because it reveals what they hide. The truly awakened one doesn't need to preach, teach, or correct. He simply is. His life becomes the message. And when he speaks, each word carries archetypal weight, as if coming from another plane. The return is, therefore, an act of compassion, returning to the midst of the noise only to leave traces of silence. But the world doesn't know what to do with those who have transcended their social role. The awakened no longer belong to the collective, but neither are they separate from it. They live on the edges, visible yet untouchable. Jung called these beings dwellers on the margins. They don't fit in, but they don't reject them either. They are bridges between the unconscious and the conscious, between shadow and light. They return not to shine, but to serve as a beacon. And those who encounter them, even without understanding, feel something strange, an old memory, an inner calling. Because the true return is never about the individual who returns, it is about what awakens in others when they appear. And this is the harbinger of a new era, built not at the center but on the margins. After the return comes the invisible work. The truly awakened don't return to the center, they begin building on the edges. Carl Jung said that genuine individuation always generates new forms of life, new values, new psychic spaces. This is what the awakened do. It creates silent refugees amidst the chaos. They are small communities, deep conversations, encounters between souls who see the same abyss. They don't announce revolutions, they sow them. While the collective chases trends, they build temples of consciousness in forgotten places. Sometimes a canal, sometimes a book, sometimes a simple gesture that restores humanity to those who were already losing faith. They are the architects of the invisible, shaping reality from inner stillness. These builders don't use force, they use frequency. They understand that true spirituality isn't about convincing, but about vibrating in a way that transforms the environment. They are therapists who listen deeply, artists who translate the collective unconscious, teachers who teach the soul, and not just content. They understand what Jung called the transcendent function, the power to unite opposites. While the world chooses sides, they build bridges. While noise divides, they silence to unite. And although they seem few, their impact is immense, because the awakened influence is not through the number of followers, but through the intensity of their presence. With each genuine act, with each word that arises from the self, something in the collective unconscious is reorganized, as if a crack of light were opening within the darkness. But no one sees them. The collective ego doesn't recognize the value of those who act without seeking applause. And it is precisely this invisibility that protects them. They know that consciousness must be cultivated in secret, like a flame in the wind. Therefore, they avoid the stage, reject noise, and refuse idolatry. They live on the margins, but they plant underground. And what sprouts from these silent roots is the beginning of a new cycle of the human psyche. Jung believed that collective transformation would begin with a few truly conscious individuals. And that is what is happening now. A new spiritual architecture is being built, brick by brick, in the shadows. But before it can fully blossom, something must die. Attachment to the old world. And this detachment is the purest form of love. Disappearing isn't giving up, it's transcending. When the self stabilizes, the need to be seen dies. The persona, which once screamed for recognition, now falls silent because it understands. True power lies in the invisible. Carl Jung said that the awakened soul doesn't leave the world out of contempt, but out of love. Love enough to no longer feed the illusions that keep it sick. It's a mature, detached, lucid love. The kind of love that allows us to see pain without trying to fix it, that understands that collective suffering isn't resolved with more noise, but with greater awareness. Disappearance is the final phase of individuation, when the soul stops seeking a stage and begins to vibrate as a presence. It doesn't seek to convince, it seeks to exist in peace. Those who disappear spiritually are not running away, they are evolving. They stop translating their depth into mass language, stop trying to fit into shallow conversations, stop begging for an ear. They understand that true spirituality is silent, that the sacred cannot be explained but is incarnated. So they choose anonymity as their altar. They live simply but radiate depth. Their trail is subtle, a word spoken at the right time, a gesture of compassion, a silence that transforms. They are in no hurry because they understand that haste is a symptom of unconsciousness. Their absence is not a void, it is a sacred space being left for others to awaken. They are like invisible masters. They walk alongside, but never in front. And perhaps this is the highest form of love, disappearing so that the real can appear. Evolution is not about accumulation, it is about disappearance. The ego dies, the self manifests, and the individual becomes a channel for what is greater than themselves. Jung called this return to the center, the point where the human and the divine meet. The world will see these disappeared as absent, but in truth they are more present than ever, just on a different frequency. They are invisible beacons, lit within the collective darkness. And if you feel this calling, this desire to withdraw, to silence, to disappear, it is not escape, it is evolution. It is the soul saying, enough of participating in the illusion, and it is from this disappearance that the new is born. Maybe the world will never understand why you walked away. Why did you stop responding, showing up, explaining yourself? But it wasn't absence, it was healing. You're just tired of mutilating yourself to fit into what doesn't see you. Carl Jung said, the price of consciousness is loneliness. And maybe that's what you're paying for now, not with suffering, but with lucidity. Because whoever wakes up loses the right to live asleep, and the silence that the world calls weakness is the same silence where the self flourishes. So tell me, do you still want to be seen, or do you finally want to be whole? Do you want to continue participating in the collective dream, or do you want to wake up once and for all? If this tore you up inside, sign up now, because that was just the first cut.